big IoT system is a fantastic DDoS attack. We would wake up at 2 a.m. and somebody had moved 1 million devices that were all connecting at once. Everything we've learned about how to do this at huge scales is now available to each one of our customers.
If you decide to go with pure open source in-house, you should better know what you're doing. Welcome to the Internet of Things equation, a podcast when I talk about the Internet of Things domain both from the technical and business perspectives. I'm Łukasz Malinowski, the Internet of Things advisor and trainer. My guest assists large enterprises in adopting IoT technologies to achieve business goals and transform organizations. Sometimes those changes are forced by external factors and fast execution is critical. That is the case we will cover today with Aaron, the CTO of well-respected IoT platform ClearBlade. Hello Aaron, thank you so much for accepting my invitation and meeting me today.
Thank you, Łukasz. It's a pleasure to be here and excited to chat with the audience about this one.
Let's start with your personal track record, if you could share it with the audience.
My background, I started in electrical and computer engineering. So I was very much an OT in the field, kind of working with hardware kind of guy, and then immediately went into software. Did software with regards to kind of how we built the web early on in my career. And now with IoT, the last 10 to 15 years has really been merging those two worlds back together again. So most of my time, while I was the original architect of our platform and our edge products, most of my time today is spent with how do you use that software, how to use it securely, how do you scale it in the different environments where our customers want it to go.
That's why I love IoT so much, because it's perfect blend of software, hardware, and everything in between. And nowadays we've got even cloud backends and distributed systems, which is even more fun to work with. Let's start by defining the IoT platform. I know that there are tons of definitions, but from your perspective, what is an IoT platform in its essence? What are the key functionalities of that platform and key components?
Yeah, so IoT platforms have existed for a while, at least in our world. We launched our product over 10 years ago as an IoT platform. It's changed. I think today the definition of IoT platform is a bit different thanks to where the hyperscalers have taken it. But originally there were companies like ClearBlade, like Ayla, Telemetry before AWS acquired them, ThingWorks, Cumulocity, these companies that originally were saying, what is it I need to do not only for a connected device, but how do I process that data and then even provide the user interface to that data? There's a lot of differences between those environments, but very often they had almost end user like user interfaces. They had the ability to write rules by an end user perspective. And then they were often, sometimes they even included their own hardware bundles. So they would ship the gateway to you or the sensor itself. For ClearBlade, we've always kind of thought of an IoT platform should at least be able to accomplish most of the back-end activities that you want, connecting the device securely, putting the custom data on the device, building the historical data about the device, not just the moment in time data, being able to stream that data to other locations, so fill a data lake, while also then being able to write and put your own custom logic. We really did think about it as an IoT solution. An IoT platform should fully run an IoT solution. But today, obviously, we see a lot of these IoT products from the clouds that are kind of a little bit of a message broker plus. They'll do a little bit of message brokering, plus they'll do some security, and then maybe we'll store your data for a little while. They're not always fully MQTT compliant. They're kind of versions of how you would at least connect a device. In the end, we've made a couple different products to serve the different users, whether it's the IT user, maybe even the OT user, maybe it's the operator. But IoT platforms, really, it is a moving definition, and it really depends on who the buyer is as to what they're going to see when they're looking for IoT platforms.
From my perspective, IoT platform needs to be trusted partner of the other side, because this is the key component of any business that utilize IoT technology. What are the factors to consider when choosing the IoT platform? I know that you offer IoT platform yourself, but from your experience, the core factors that anyone should consider when choosing IoT platform.
Yeah, I find it easiest to answer these questions when I separate myself from ClearBlade and just think if I was trying to build this and buy this, what would I be looking for? I think number one, a lot of people have recently been burned by big companies that jumped into IoT and then really weren't ready to stay committed to IoT. it's not the most popular term right now. AI is more popular. So right now you really have to, you're finding out who's really committed, right? You're finding out who maybe is not having to pivot to other areas. You're finding out who's got the actual customer base and revenue to continue to support their ecosystem. So I think that's important. Probably the first thing is does this partner of ours, do they have the staying power in this business? Do they understand this business well enough that they will stay there with you? Because nobody's building IoT to last a few years, right? Nobody's building IoT to migrate it again later. I think a lot of us, we might build websites in WordPress. No one will migrate it later. We might do other activities that we think will migrate later. But IoT it's foundational. It's going to be on embedded devices. And so you have to look for that. And then the thing that's often forgotten, although I've seen that you've done some different posts on it and different webcasts on it, but you really have to make sure the partner aligns with your business model. But you don't necessarily need a partner that's built the exact solution you want, but you need someone that is going to charge you in a way that you can continue to make it all work. If you don't know how many messages it's going to be, if you don't know how you're going to scale in 5 or 6 years, you need someone that at least understands and charges you in a way that will protect your business model for the total cost of ownership. If you're building a product, then you've got a bill of materials. So you have to work with that BOM. You need a partner that knows how to price their software in a way that can fit per product or per device. In other cases, if you've got a problem and you need to see this problem, how is it going to cost to solve, then your budget, right? So I think that's key too. And the last one is, and it goes with commitment, is are you flexible? Has this partner proven to be flexible enough? Because nobody is done with IoT. I've seen no product come to market and stay the same product, whether it was, Roombas and vacuums or whether it's connected oil wells, whatever it is. Every product is still continuing to be improved and advanced. So anybody who might have chosen a solution 5 years ago, protocols have updated, security models have updated, all these things have happened and changed over time that ultimately, if your partner is not keeping up, not staying flexible, not build an architecture that will do these new types of authentication, then you could be in real trouble. So those are the 3 pillars, basically: commitment, the ability to match your pricing model or how you go to market, and then being flexible enough to the future.
Those are great points. Let me elaborate on them for the audience, because you mentioned some crucial aspects, and I would start with the billing itself. As you said, the IoT platform is investment for number of years. Hopefully your business will grow, number of messages will grow, number of devices will grow, and you need to have a trusted partner that can essentially scale, not to consume or from margins in the process. So having very clear pricing model, it is absolutely crucial. And actually the hyperscalers are doing pretty bad job at it, because the pricing of those offering is so complex that very few people are actually understand it, that even fewer people can predict your costs in the future, unfortunately. And this is part of their strategy, and that is not really fair.
Yeah, and what's fascinating about what you say is the way the hyperscalers have priced, no matter how good they get at that, you never feel the reward. So if they increase performance, if they do stuff that's all just better for them, at ClearBlade, we try to price in a way that if we have a good improvement or something of that, then everybody wins, right? Our customers share in that speed up. And I think that's important, right? I mean, I think that's a more mature relationship. It's a personal relationship, but that lets everybody succeed.
Yes, and the other thing, I observed the IoT market for a few years now, and the general IoT solutions offered by those hyperscalers, I got the feeling that they offer IoT services because everyone else does, at least used to have, where IoT was on the top of the hype, but now, like, most of them are picking up that it is not that easy to operate IoT platform and provide IoT services. In some cases, it might be not high margin, and they decide to quit. So that brings me to the core topic of our today's conversation. What is the impact of shutting down IoT offering by the provider? Because you saw that firsthand. And since IoT platform is crucial for operations, could you closely summarize the impact of the IoT provider shutting down their offering?
Yeah. There were I think four big shutdowns last year. There's certainly rumors in the market, nothing substantiated, but there's rumors in the market this year about others. When you connect your stuff, your devices to an IoT platform, you're often writing firmware, especially if you're doing at a price point where you're selling a product. So you're talking about firmware. This is code probably written in C or C++. This means it's complex, right? There's some complexity to those lower level binaries. You're putting that code on an embedded device and you're putting it in the field. And probably if you were early at this, you weren't really thinking about updates, OTAs early on. You were probably not really worried about the IoT provider because you were just going to go with them and they made you promises. So really, you've written some code that's hard to understand, that's hard to change, and it's locked directly at what we call a URI, a URL, a server endpoint. On the server side, you want that secure, so you have to encrypt it. There's a certificate authority that handles encryption. There's authentication. There's different patterns for that. Different vendors use different patterns for authentication. Very few of them use the default MQTT pattern, which was a basic auth kind of model. They all had their own patterns for what they did. And then, for better or worse, a lot of these IoT platforms, they did MQTT like behaviors, but they did it in their own way.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of parameters, and there's actually a lot of ambiguity in MQTT once you really get into it. But they all kind of made their own models. While you might have been using a standard, there's a lot of little ways that things could go bad for your hard coded firmware to get connected. So when somebody shuts down, you have to really look at, even if this was the exact same feature for feature, I now own this device and have to update this device. And that really is the scary part of a change, because a provider like ClearBlade, a provider like others probably can match feature for feature, but getting the nuances of what that other platform was doing can be painful.
This is pure experience speaking from your perspective, and I want to underline that it is not that everyone is using MQTT, because this is not the same MQTT as you said. This is extremely important to understand that there are those edge cases that are extremely hard to detect and to test, and after you switch, then something will break and you don't know why. And the same goes, as you said, with the platform backend features. We kind of can compare one to the other, but the way that they handle quality of service is sometimes different. The way they handle routing and other stuff. There are also small changes that are not obvious when you look at the documentation, and then they will blow up in your face. So this is very
Yeah.
important.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, again, not to go too deep into MQTT, but just the rate at which, if you subscribe or you automatically publish a retain message to the device, if you change the order of that, you can break everybody's firmware. Both are perfectly legal according to MQTT, but if people wrote the firmware the wrong way, then suddenly you have 20,000 devices that might be restarting infinitely, right? Which is a huge workload to show up on a server all of a sudden. So it is the nuances of how the MQTT has been implemented and how you've written your firmware to meet its behavior that really makes a fascinating moment when you're migrating.
My personal favorite is that the quality of service level 0 should be at least once delivery, but some providers can send duplicated messages even for quality of service level 0. That happens very infrequently, but if that does happen and your firmware is not able to cope with duplicates, as you said, device will freak out and bad things may happen. So very, very tricky stuff. But let's say that you are in a position, as your customers were some time ago, that unfortunately your trusted provider is not that trusted and shuts down the IoT offering. So how to handle migration from your existing provider to new? And I created a poll on LinkedIn asking that question and asked if you should move everything, so your devices, your analytics, and your data to the new provider, or only the connectivity part and device management part, and leave everything on the previous provider. And what surprised me was the 50 to 50 split. So yeah, that was really interesting. What's your take on that? If you could elaborate on those two approaches, on pros and cons on both of them.
Yeah, so I think you're probably getting a difference of a large organization versus a small organization in probably how they're viewing it. I think a large organization would break up the problem to many different owners. So when your IoT platform retires, these other owners don't want their stuff to retire, right? They want to be able to keep doing their job. So I can totally see how this is split. I know when we saw it, we used to do lots of migrations, from legacy platforms to new platforms, whether it was going from desktop to mobile or mainframe to local Java applications, and in my experience was you change just the piece you have to change. It's like changing the engine. You want the whole car to be the same. The user's going to value it like the car. So you can't try to go sell new features out of the gate. You just need to replace the engine. So we generally looked at the migrations that happened last year as a let's make the moving of the communication as simple as possible and let all the other stakeholders be able to not have change happen to them. That doesn't mean they might change in the future, but we really wanted to focus on solving the actual problem so that everything else worked. We thought that was really, really important because if you can do what the provider was doing the same, then you can build a good relationship with those folks for future opportunities, for the analytics, for the downstream data lake, for the AI as well.
And I believe that this also reduces the risk of the migration, because if you migrate only the pieces that you've got to migrate and leave the analytics aside, then your scope is smaller, and as a result, you can do things way faster and iterate faster. Because I'm a huge believer in the iterative approach, and personally, like from my professional experience, I would never leave that split as the end state to have the communication in one cloud, let's say, and the analytics in the other, for the simple reason of costs moving data around between two cloud providers or on-prem and cloud, because that costs a lot of money if we are speaking about huge load. So that's
Mhm.
why for me it was a bit surprising that there were folks that decided to move on the communication. But as you said, huge enterprises got different stakeholders, and stakeholders not impacted by change of communication only, they are not very that happy to put operations at risk and move everything around.
Yeah, but you allude to a really good point, and that's something else where we worked really hard was the cost, right? And so moving between clouds, yes, is expensive, but the service itself had a cost, So however you were paying for that per device, per message, per megabyte, that pricing model also is really important because whatever product you have, whatever IoT solution you have, in theory, it's working in terms of ROI. You're paying X for it, it's producing you this much value. And so what that solution was costing you has already been figured out. If you move IoT platforms, communication or everything, you have to redo all of that math and validation. So when we looked at it last year, we said, let's match the pricing model because then everybody knows the ROI still works, right? So maybe it wasn't perfect for ClearBlade. We could have maybe made more or maybe made less or changed the offering. But for us, we said it's a much easier decision for everyone if they don't have to redo the calculation. Back to that point, will this company work with us, and how we know we can make value with the solution? And so that was another kind of really, leverage point for us of not only, can we offer the same type of features, but more importantly, does it cost us the same, or do we have to go back to the CFO? Do we have to go back to the business? Do we have to justify new costs?
I think that was extremely smart move, because IoT devices, they are designed for 10, 15 years of lifetime. And those margins per unit are extremely limited. So if your pricing would differ in whatever regard from the legacy provider, that might even flip the whole use case around, and there will be no reason for them to continue offering, which might be difficult if we are speaking about OT. As you said, like lifespan in OT is 30 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
So that's even more difficult. But providing that very honest approach, I would say that we will match whatever the other provider was billing you, and we will figure out the math on our side, because you need to earn as well, right? It's not that you
Yeah.
will pay for serving your customers. But that is very, very good approach. To be honest, I was not aware of that. You made that move, but it made business decisions, business stakeholders way easier job in order to not recalculate all the above.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's key. And the nice thing about that for ClearBlade is, all of the performance gains we may get as we get better at this solution are now our profit. So we're not able to share that in those models. But in that case, we knew out of the gate it was going to be this profitable. And now as we've gotten better at it, it gains in what we're able to do with it. So.
Well, this is the approach I respect personally, because you take the risk because you are the expert in your field. Your customers are not IoT experts, they are experts in their respective domains. And this is the way that it should have been. You can predict your margins, you can predict the optimizations sometime in the future. So taking that risk that you will cover those short-term losses if those appear later on, this is essential. Let's move further. Let's elaborate on technical and operational challenges during migration from one IoT provider to the other, because you saw that firsthand. How does it look?
Yeah, so there was a lot ClearBlade could make easy. The platform side, we can make the features work the same. We have a lot of flags in our underlying platform to be able to turn on and off those MQTT oddities. So, as we understood them, we made the retain, the ordering of the pub sub, all of that stuff, we were able to kind of make sure we matched. We were also able to match how do you migrate. So really being able to say, point at the old one, bring it over, copy it over. Obviously you have to put credentials in, but when it was all said and done, once you had your config, you hit go, we could do the automatic migration with that one kind of button click. What wasn't one click is all of those devices out there. So while they communicate the same, we were able to repeat the authentication model. So the big one out there where we had the most was using an asynchronous key model, which is a private cert and a public cert. Private certs never moved off the device, which is a great model. We were able to recreate that. So every device that was able to authenticate before could authenticate the exact same. That's code. That's that firmware code I talked about that writes that. So if you keep that the same, then nobody's touching some dirty, some tough stuff. What we couldn't keep was where were these devices pointed? Whether it was a device that was going to an IBM cloud, an SAP cloud, a Google cloud, wherever it was going, that was an endpoint of that provider. That's actually something that we've provided customers a way around, so they don't have to lock into a clearblade.com endpoint. But ultimately, most people were using that endpoint the same way they're using an Azure or an AWS endpoint today. So you have to change that URI. That's a one-line code change, but you'd have to change that. The other thing is a lot of these hyperscalers are big enough that they're their own certificate authority. They're their own trusted provider. That means when your device connects, it goes to the cloud, it negotiates that they trust each other. That little green lock in your browser is done by a third party. Well, if your third party is yourself, you own that process, you would have used a root of trust from one of those self providers. Most of us in the real world use someone like DigiCert. We use a third party trust. We might use Let's Encrypt today. And we had to switch that. We don't own the certificate authorities from those hyperscalers. So we switched to using a public certificate authority. That's a file that has to get changed on all the devices. But really, by changing just those two things, most of our customers were able to completely retarget their devices. So it was a one-time OTA update on the devices that would switch them over. The data routed the same in most cases, so we still send it downstream the same. So operations of how it all worked was most likely the same for all the customers. They were still seeing the same dashboards get updated and whatever. The only place there might have been some challenges is if they did subsets of devices. Where do we go back to get the data downstream? That might have been it. If they had a long migration, they would have to work out when do they send it to one of the providers versus when do they send it to ClearBlade. But all in all, you can make this pretty easy. I think this was a strength of ours as well. Even if you were just shopping to find out who can migrate, ClearBlade was able to let you migrate in 30 minutes. We open sourced the tool. So if you decided you didn't want to use our kind of little graphical UI, you had a million devices, you could run this over a weekend and slowly migrate all your devices in. So we worked hard to make that easy. And then in the end, I think a couple providers were able to think of it that way and do that. Others had kind of built from scratch, which would have been a whole different ball of wax. Trying to use open source meant you were putting all that down yourself. Who owns it? Who builds a security model in? Can you recreate all of the nuances? Those are all risks if you go a different pattern, so to speak.
Okay, once again, I need to summarize what you said because you provided tons of value, and I afraid that it might be not that evident for someone with a bit less experience. So you mentioned two crucial aspects or attributes that needs to be changed during migration, and there is no way around it, which is the endpoint that device communicates to, because there is some endpoint, even if you are using like proxies or whatever, there is that URL or IP or whatever that device is targeting. So this is something extremely important. As I said, it's hopefully that is just a configuration change on the firmware side, but still it needs to be changed remotely. And the other thing, which is way more tricky, is that certificate. And certificate is essentially the proof of identity for a specific device. And what you said is very true, is that those hyperscalers, they own the root CA certificate. So they create the chain of trust on their own. And since you need to change the whole chain of trust, essentially you need to change the ID of your those devices while keeping those IDs the same. It is kind of hard to understand if without going into details, but you need to do tons of magic on the backend in order not to change anything on the firmware side, or at least change that very, very minimal. So I respect that approach, that you take that on your side. You're not saying, dear customer, you need to completely flush your device and then this is new firmware that you will install, because this is the approach that I often see in the market and I do not support that. But what you said, this is the minimal set of attributes that have got to be changed, and rest is just your hard work on the backend to make the switch, which is great.
And I think that speaks to one of those attributes I talked about, the flexibility. You may like MTLS based off, but you may want to change to asynchronous off, asymmetric keys or whatever, right? And so that flexibility is part of the platform's what you should shop for, right? Somebody who can meet these different cases, different requirements in the business and such. It's a good point.
Yeah, and actually, this is something that we briefly touched on when talking about general features of IoT platform, is that it needs to meet various security requirements, because different customers have got different security requirements. Some of them are forced by legal, some of them are forced by industry or whatever else. So when you offer an IoT solution as a platform provider, it's not like you've got only this set of keys and you're done, right? You need to offer the whole suite of features and let your customers choose and pick whatever they need, while keeping that as simple as possible so they don't have to really understand what they are doing, right? So it is, once again, a bit of paradox of being the IoT provider.
Yeah, no, a real interesting one has been when MQTT comes out, all devices are allowed to talk to any topic, right? Other than some private topics. But in general, everybody can talk to any topic. But that's not a good practice in real life. In general, you want your device to be able to send something and receive something and have it be a private conversation, so to speak. So a lot of these platforms and providers have put boundaries around how do you put topic scoping to device. All of the migrations last year had patterns for that, but the pattern wasn't compliant with the specification, right? So ClearBlade as an IoT platform had to be able to implement the pattern, but also keep the overall product open enough such that you could have new patterns. So in theory, you know how AWS works well, right? They allow lots of topics for each device to communicate on. So in that case, we can honor that pattern, but we could also honor one like what Google did, where it had a config and a command, topic pattern, telemetry pattern. So that's key as well, right? And what will we do next year? Who knows what we're going to need the next year, where we need different types of devices. So you have to be able to really be able to open up the platform to whatever that pattern is, and then if you're happy with that pattern, you can go as long as you want. But at time, you'll probably change that and need flexibility.
This is actually extremely interesting topic, and I need to ask this question. What's your point on that? Should the IoT platform provider provide the full flexibility to the end users so you can choose whatever you want, you can send all the data to the same topic, or should you handhold your customer and say, well, if you really want to, you can do that, but we strongly recommend doing something else because it will allow you to scale, it will be more secure, and generally this is just a best practice, so trust me and use the recommended pattern. What's your take on that? Because you're talking about flexibility, but just using MQTT as an example, the
Mhm.
MQTT standard is extremely flexible, and it is its core weakness and strength at the same time. So it's double-edged sword, really.
Yeah, so we have the product called IoT Core that has a pattern built into it. Every device has four, two topics to send up on and two to send down on, and it has a pattern. We call that a template. It's a system template in our enterprise offering. So essentially, we have multiple patterns that you can use as system templates. That some are very narrow. They're going to give you best practices. They'll allow you to connect a device in a secure way, and it will then send the data downstream, whether it's to Kinesis, to PubSub, to Kafka, and it will move the data through. So we've built some patterns, but I truly believe I don't know all the patterns yet. I don't think we've defined them all. So if you go into our enterprise product, you can define topic patterns, per device ID, per user ID. You can basically build out patterns and roles for every little piece and part of how that might go. So while we're going to give you some best practices, we will give you some templates that work out of the box for a lot of what we see. We fully expect somebody to come in and say, hey, when we get data, we want it to be, secure for this subset of devices, but then we want to be able to publish to Kafka or produce to Kafka and also put it into an S3 bucket. And that's totally normal. So you have to be able to unlock behind the scenes, I think, with that flexibility, if you're going to really serve this market
Mhm.
broadly.
Yeah, well, I agree with you that if the customer really knows what they're doing or they really want to do something that is against best practices but vital to their business case, then that's fine. What I'm
Yeah.
against is not showing them the best practices. So you should show them those practices, but if they decide not to use them, that's at the end of the day they are the owners, right?
Yeah, and that's the risk when you build it yourself or you go open source. You better learn it all because you're now accountable for it all.
Exactly. So since you brought the topic, what's your take on building the IoT platform using open source components? Let's say that the IoT provider decided to shut down and the smart CTO of that company decided I can piece the whole solution using open source. What's your take on that? Because I've got my own opinion, but I would like to know yours.
Yeah, well, obviously I'm a vendor and I'm selling something, and I think what we sell is good.
Mhm.
But I had this conversation the other day. If I go to any university, I will probably find 40 very smart computer science students that have all built their own IoT platforms using open source. So is it possible to do? Yes. I think you could totally go out there and build it. I think, you could build a whole IoT solution with that mindset. There's a reason, though, that ClearBlade doesn't use an open source broker inside of us. We'd love to be able to reuse somebody else's component, but there's a reason when it comes to scalability, when it comes to us being able to build that security model, when it comes to us being able to apply different authentication models, those sorts of things, and then actually price and performance. So scaling this thing up at a flexible way. And so while I totally agree it will work, and I agree that if you're a small installation, maybe you're totally behind a firewall, I think it's interesting to think about open source. It really struggles in a true IoT world where your devices are on public internet and they're backhauling over that. It becomes a tremendous amount of work. It becomes basically running a full-time cloud service, which means you have people who are experts updating your software all the time, making sure that it scales up, growing the Kubernetes cluster if that's how you've decided to do it. So the maintenance of running that becomes extremely high, and there's the risk associated with how do you scale it, because you are growing device count. So I love open source. We use some pieces. We don't rebuild databases, obviously, underneath the covers. Our view is right now where the market is to put all these pieces together. There's a lot of risk still in building with just open source.
My personal opinion is if you decide to go with pure open source in-house, you should better know what you're doing, as you said, because you might get in tons of troubles, like you might create some security issues along the way without really understanding that. And essentially, you need to become an IoT expert and expert in designing and building distributed systems, even if you are using someone else's code along the way, which is like this is a huge knowledge to absorb. And in my opinion, most of the time, this is probably, even from business perspective, it is not the best choice in terms of the money spent and time spent.
Yeah, I think people underestimate. I mean, again, I love MQTT. We've been part of it since it was, before it was an Oasis standard. But people underestimate the fact that this isn't running over our HTTP protocol, where there's a lot of normality and proxies and load balancers already built. This thing it's a TCP-based protocol, TLS termination. How is that going to get done? You really may have to even learn how the whole TLS negotiation works if you're really going to handle these header packers and make header packets and make sure it all works correctly. So it does go extremely low level. And then there's times where we'll find that if we do go extremely low level, we'll get a 50% performance boost. So these are things that, if you're trying to work with that bill of materials and margin matters, that's where you're going to find it. And you won't be able to control that if you're owning it all yourself.
Yeah. You can dive into that rabbit hole as deep as you wish, and there's always something to learn. I'm learning all the time, even though I spent a few years in IoT myself. So, out of curiosity, are you willing to share which pieces of your IoT platform are built in-house? And because you decided that the open source is not good for whatever reason, security, scalability, compliance, whatever, and you decided that you've got the skills to build that yourself.
Yeah, so the MQTT broker we built fully in-house, and essentially the middleware around it for security and such it's all tied together. So that's all about performance, so to speak. So very easily doing that. We use a SQL-based database behind us. Postgres is the one that we like, although we could change it. We also abstract to all the other databases in the cloud, so it can go to BigQuery, to Redshift. We don't really care, but we do have one that will persist in. We do use some load balancing software. HA Proxy is the one that we like for TLS termination. It doesn't do a ton for you for MQTT, so your broker still has to handle a good bit, especially session sharing and bridging, but we use that. We use some caching middleware as well. Redis is an option for that, whether you use a cloud hosted or you use it running through us. Those are probably the main components that you would think of as traditional open source middleware. There are some libraries we really like. We use a JavaScript interpreter. That's how we are able to kind of move your logic around very quickly and burst it up without having to spin up containers or whatever. We use both V8 and we use something called duct tape, two different types of engines. One's much more memory performant, one's much faster, so you can change. And then we also have some AI built into us. So we use the Onyx libraries, onyx.ai. So again, we're not trying to rebuild everything where people have built great, open source implementations, but we are trying to make sure where we need to own the life cycle, the process, the security, the scalability, that we own those pieces. So, I mean, it's pretty nuanced. It's a very good question to kind of dive into of what do you build when you're trying to build your own platform.
Thank you for those insights. I was extremely curious, and the tools that you mentioned, like the caching database and HA proxy, those are, I would say, industry standard. Like this is the way that personally I used for global scale IoT deployments myself, and I know that they can handle the load and they are secure and whatnot. So extremely well designed solution. I would like to go to the business side, even though I could spend any time speaking about technology with you, but let's elaborate for a moment on the case studies. So you helped a number of customers migrate out of the Google, when Google decided to shut down their offering. So if you could walk us through some of those migrations, and how can you even prepare for that migration when you work with the customer, how you execute that, and what was the outcome?
Yeah, so we do have some public case studies. So if anybody wants that, you can certainly go to our website and kind of read about the different companies that did it. Talsite, Nava, Zimi, Salacru, Mamava. They're all product providers. I think is kind of common about them. Common IoT products that serve different needs. What was great about this migration is once we understood it, to your point, Lucas, is that once we understood it, we were able to make it self-service. So that means that we were able, people might have said, hey, help us. What can you do? We were saying, here's your instruction list. Start with go and hit this button and we'll copy all of your information over. So you can see your devices in ClearBlade. You can go back and see they're the same. And then there's a pretty short list. Change that URI, update that root certificate, and then restart your firmware and now see that data roll through. So the preparation business case, I think that was a strength of ours. What was interesting, well, and so that was the general life cycle. So a lot of folks then basically, once we armed them with that, they ran a practice migration. Maybe they moved a device in the lab and like, wow, it works the exact same. So then they would make their own plan. Often they would move a subset of devices, maybe 10%, and let it run for a week. And then we would see 10,000, 100,000 devices move all at once. It was a crazy time for ClearBlade because you can imagine most of the time IoT scales like this, and we were just doing this, right? Right. So we would wake up at 2 a.m. and somebody had moved 1 million devices that were all connecting at once, right? So you talk about needing to have dynamic infrastructure. We learned a ton, probably in a use case we'll never see again, to just handle that massive workload. A lot of drama on our side to get through that massive change, but from our standpoint of what the customer experienced, our goal was for them to have one clear migration process and then flip the firmware over and at their own pace. And that, I think that's generally what they experienced. I think that's why we had a positive relationship with a lot of the folks there that they were coming out of it. There was another class of customer that, well, go ahead. I'll let you ask.
Out of curiosity, have you put any cap of number of devices you could migrate in one batch, or whatever number of devices someone would like to move over, you will handle that? Because as you said, like this is something that probably is not that obvious for people without backend experience, but just switching a few million devices from one provider to the other, this is a huge shock for the backend infrastructure, and you cannot prepare for that upfront if this is self-service. So that is pretty awesome stuff to pull off, to be honest.
Yeah. I mean, we have our own cost constraints and reasons why we're trying to keep our cluster the right size. We don't want to oversize it out of the gate. You can imagine. We did in our migration tool, we built some pacing, so to speak, some throttling of how fast it would migrate devices. But you could basically point it at 2 million devices and say go, and we would just start moving those devices over. If something happened to the tool, then it would know its state, so it could pick up where it left off. So we tried to make that smart enough. So, we definitely had some customers with millions of devices, and it took them a long weekend to move that many devices. They probably could have turned up the volume, right? It was all APIs. These are all APIs that have been documented by the other providers for how to pull devices and create devices. There were cloud throttles, built in to protect you, but people could have tried to hit us, and we had to make sure we handled that ourselves and protected. A lot of what we saw was learning to protect ourselves from people who didn't know they were being bad actors.
Yeah.
To your point, a big IoT system is a fantastic DDoS attack, right? I mean, it's basically a denial of service attack is a good IoT solution. So essentially everything you're doing is to build a solution that handles and gracefully accepts a denial of service attack until everything stabilizes. We also saw, a lot of interesting things with, if when large batches of devices reconnected, maybe a network happened, maybe we had a container crash. So suddenly, 1/6 of the workload reconnects all at once. What does that mean? And for us, we learned to handle it, but it's a downstream problem as well for customers when suddenly 1/6 of their devices all fire their cloud functions or whatever they may have, their lambdas go off. So, learning to gracefully help your customers deal with the workload they created in the front was also a big part of this. So it was a wild experience, migrating this kind of data set or workload for sure.
The way you put it, that is a DDoS attack, it reminds me of a story of my customer that they said that they want to use quality of service level 1 of MQTT communication for even telemetry messages. And for the audience, that means that device will resend messages till it gets confirmation from the MQTT broker. And because of that, they destroyed their own backend, essentially, because they were network outage. Devices try to resend messages, so everything piled up. And after the network was back re-enabled, the MQTT broker at the end just crashed because it was DDoSed, as you said, by their own devices sending legit data. But sometimes when you send telemetry data, you can afford losing a few messages if they are not critical. So they learned the hard way that quality of service level 0, which means at most once, really makes sense to send some data points that are not business critical. So that's a great way to put it. And if you expose that self-service batch migration to your customers, you expose your backend to those DDoS attacks, and you need to design the backend to handle that. And the things that you casually said about putting throttling on your end, putting probably some batches or micro batches on your end that are not exposed to the end users. But this is tons of architecture work and development work just to protect yourself in those cases.
Yeah, and what's great for us is, because our solution was just a template on top of our core enterprise product, everything we've learned about how to do this at huge scales is now available to each one of we have a lot of private customers, private tenancy. Quite frankly, a lot of customers that migrated from one of those other hyperscalers last year, they were been looking for more, right? They wanted more capability. They wanted QoS2 in some cases, right? So they wanted to do more, and that wasn't being served there. And I understand why. It's way too hard to push new features into that environment. But if you're in a private tenancy, now you can bring in new features, your devices, you're only impacting yourself. And we offer that now with all of that experience. How do we keep them from giving themselves a DDoS and breaking their own backends downstream from us? That's all lessons that were able to come in. So it was a great experience for ClearBlade. Certainly made our product a lot better.
Well, okay, so final comment from my side for the audience listening. Just in case you wonder, the QoS2, as Aaron said, is not supported by the AWS IoT broker. Still, this is documented in MQTT standard for a number of years now, and that implementation doesn't support. So if ClearBlade supports that, this differentiates your offering from AWS. And I'm just pointing out on AWS because I know they're offering extremely well. So yeah, this is pretty significant value added if you migrate from AWS, let's say, to the ClearBlade, because now you can use QoS2, which means that you guarantee that your message will be delivered exactly once, which is critical if you want, for instance, to change configuration of your devices in the field.
Yeah, no, and QoS2 is hard. There's a reason why it hasn't been done. And you can imagine if a device goes offline for 30 days, how much is it missed that you're supposed to recover according to QoS2. So you have to put, even with the spec, you have to put your own rules to protect yourself of how much will you store and put into the history that to recover from. So
Yeah.
it's fascinating. No, it's a great market to serve, and all the flexibility that's required is pretty exciting.
For me personally, IoT is fascinating because all of those challenges you encounter and because of the infinite learning journey and experience that you're on. We're running out of time, but if you could summarize the services offered by ClearBlade, you mentioned a few of them, but let's give us a quick summary of what you offer and what's the best way to start if our listeners would like to utilize your platform.
Yeah. So back to your kind of original question you posed to everyone, we have an offering called IoT Core, which is essentially like the communication part. It matches what a lot of the hyperscalers do today. Devices securely connect, send data downstream to PubSub, Kinesis, whatever it needs to go, Kafka. That's our IoT Core product. That product actually runs on what is our IoT enterprise offering, and that's a private platform that can do much, much more. So that's where you can go in and customize your permissions. You can write custom logic in your functions, in your services. You can store your own data structures. You can use different authentication models, whether it's asymmetric keys or MTLS. And really, you can put your own third-party trust on it. So you can put your own server CA. So a lot of flexibility in there. A lot of folks are using that. And then we have a product called Edge. That's where we take everything we just did in the cloud that scaled up and handled it, and we run it on a Raspberry Pi or an industrial gateway. So we'll drop your full MQTT broker, your data, your code onto your Raspberry Pi, and then we'll move that logic, that data back and forth for you. That's great if you're doing heavy equipment, if you have buildings and facilities, getting your BACnet data, that's a good one. And then we've put a front end on all of it. It's an application. It's a no-code application. So it's designed for you just to go in and say, I want to create a truck. And you have a truck, and you have 4 tires and an engine with temperatures and air pressures. That product's called Intelligent Assets. It lets you kind of build your digital twins and write your rules and alerts around it. It sits on top of everything. So data from IoT Core, data from your edges, data that's sent directly in to your enterprise, whether it's from Kafka or a third-party sensor, can all then show up in one user interface. So try to offer kind of the journey. We don't force you to have all of them. You can pick what was best for you. But we definitely want to serve both the IT, the firmware developer, the server cloud folks, and the operators along the way.
Perfect. From my perspective, it looks like a full stack offering. As you said, you can pick what you need, but if you want to have a fully functional IoT platform, this is what you provide as well, all the way to the digital twins. You mentioned AI sometime during our conversation and other features. And all of those are bells and whistles. They are fun, but if the core is not working, then everything falls apart. This is something that is worth remembering when you decide to migrate from existing cloud provider to the other. Pick someone not only based on the most recent version of ChatGPT it supports, but also the IoT core or wherever the IoT MQTT broker they are using. Aaron, thank you so much for sharing all those insights. I hope that it will be interesting for the audience. It was for sure interesting for me to speaking with you, to asking all of those questions, to learn how you designed a ClearBlade platform, because my personal opinion is that it is very well designed and our conversation just proved this point.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me, Łukasz.
Thank you for listening. Go to thefingers.com to find more materials about the Internet of Things domain. My name is Łukasz Malinowski, the Internet of Things advisor and trainer.